3 tips to prepare for retirement. Number 1 is have a plan. I think one of the things that I probably say most often in my office, and unfortunately I don't get to say this to everybody, is I'll say, hey, you have all of the assets, all of the pension, all of the Social Security that you need for a successful retirement plan, and you can retire today. However, you're missing a plan. And if you don't have a plan and basically walk with a plan, there's a chance that you run short on assets or that you overspend, or maybe that if we have a correction that you have so much at risk that all of a sudden you fall victim to sequence of returns and your portfolio takes a devastating loss at the beginning of your retirement versus at the end when you've had a good bull market to grow those assets the first 5, 7, or 10 years. So one thing that I'd encourage you is maybe you have a financial advisor that's done a great job growing the assets and you've had somebody that's helped you with tax preparation. But if you sat down with a retirement planning specialist that puts together an income plan, that puts together a plan for minimizing taxes, those are the things that really matter in what we call the distribution phase. And so I would just say make sure that as your season of life shifts and changes, that you're working with somebody that specializes in retirement, specializes in minimizing taxes, specializes in helping you create more income off of your investments instead of just big returns, because the name of the game in retirement is income. So I would just say if you've never sat down with a retirement planning specialist that's put together a spend down plan, meaning out of your investments, you have pre-tax, post-tax, you've got your Roth accounts, where do you pull from and in what order? We can help with that.
There's going to be a lot of variables. And I know we say this a lot, like it depends. Your situation depends specifically on you, your goals, objectives, what you're hoping to accomplish. I would say that, whoever the news anchor you're listening to, that person is not your financial advisor. The news is relevant. It's important. It matters. They're talking about things that may affect your portfolio, but that person doesn't have an interest in making sure that you're making good, sound financial decisions that preserve your retirement savings and make sure that you have enough to last you the entirety of your retirement. So I would say that, just as, of course, I'm not saying don't listen to the news. The news is important, but don't take your investment decisions or your retirement plan shouldn't come from the guy that's on the news, right? You should sit down with your financial advisor. You should have a realistic conversation. Like sometimes, we're talking about health history. We're talking about what you plan to do in terms of your beneficiaries. Like, are you leaving things behind to a charity? Do you have children that have, maybe have grandchildren with special needs? Like everyone's situation is completely different. Typically we start with your fixed sources of income, understanding what your expenses are today and how those might change. Like a lot of retirees, they look to upgrade their vehicle. They look to make all the repairs on their home and upgrade everything they can so that for the next 20 years, they can coast through retirement. So there's a lot of those upfront expenses. Some people really prioritize traveling and making sure they have as much leisure time in retirement. So sometimes it's a little heavier on the front end, and then they scale back on some of those things. In your plan, like whatever you put in place, like one thing that I know for sure is it's going to change. Whatever you decide, it's going to change, but you're still better off having a plan, and then you can adapt and you can make changes over time to that plan rather than just trying to wing it, right? People who try to wing it rarely end up where they want to end.
Number 2, take advantage of Roth accounts. We find that a lot of people have the majority of their retirement in tax deferred accounts, 401ks, 403bs, TSPs, which obviously all become IRAs. Traditional retirement accounts are a great way to save for retirement. They lower your taxes throughout the year as you make contributions. However, you have to pay taxes on those earnings when you start pulling money out at your ordinary income tax rates. What's nice about a Roth account is while you do pay taxes for the money going in, not only do you never pay taxes on that money again, but you don't pay taxes on what you've put in plus on any of the growth. And so one of the things that we help a lot of people with, if they're 2 to 5 years or 7 or 10 years from retirement, is starting to max out the Roth accounts so that they can create more tax-free money in retirement.
In the earlier years of retirement, we see people take a couple of different approaches here. So we're talking maybe after the age of 62 when you're eligible to receive a Social Security benefit. In some families, what they do is, hey, we've just retired. We've been paying taxes for our entire careers, and now we finally get a tax break. We're going to enjoy a tax holiday. Maybe the only source of income you have is Social Security or a pension, or if you're married, only one of you's turned on that benefit. and you really just enjoy those earlier years where you don't have to pay a lot in taxes. Other people take a different approach, and I lean towards taking a different approach. Don't just take a tax holiday. Like if you're still in the 10% or 12% bracket, right? Maybe consider filling that bracket up. Whether you're doing Roth conversions, moving money from your traditional pre-tax accounts to your Roth IRA and filling up the 12% tax bracket, or simply living off of your retirement savings, or considering living off the retirement savings and letting your Social Security benefits grow. Like it's going to serve you well, especially if eventually you get to the point where, hey, now for sure you've reached the age of 70. Both of your Social Security benefits are turned on if you're married. Eventually you reach the age of 72 or 73. Now you have required minimum distributions. Certainly your pensions are turned on well before that. And maybe you've gotten a part-time job in retirement and you're in the situation where now you make more money than you did when you were working. And I know that seems crazy, but for a lot of people, that's the case. And you're going to look back at those years where you were taking a tax holiday, and you're going to wish that you did some planning during those years, because now you're paying more in taxes than you wanted to pay. So I would say that, take a look at that, do some projections, put a plan in place, right? A lot of it's going to depend on your preferences, right? Some of this stuff, the benefit here isn't necessarily, it doesn't graph well always, right? You can't always put it on a spreadsheet and show the outcome perfectly. But sometimes it means you end up having more money in a Roth IRA. Sometimes it means that you're passing on money, your legacy funds, what you're passing on to your beneficiaries, like they're receiving it in a better, more tax advantaged way. So depending on what you're hoping to accomplish, there's a lot of different things to do. And you might very well decide, hey, I'm just going to take that tax holiday, and that's okay too. I don't know how to handle that conversation, especially when someone's like, they can't wait. They're counting down the days, and I'm listening to everything. I'm taking notes. I'm plugging it into the software, and it's like, hey, how do I tell you, like, you shouldn't retire?
Well, you know what? Here's what I've found. So 12 years of being in the financial services business and sitting down with people, one of the things I've found, and it's really interesting, but I've seen a pattern in this, is if somebody knows they can retire today and everything's going to be okay, it makes it easier going to work than feeling like they have to go to work until a certain date. Because one of the things I think that money does, and money doesn't solve everything, but it solves a lot. But one of the best things that having money does is it gives you options. And I've had dozens and dozens of people, men and women, over the last, I would say specifically 7 years since we started our office. I've noticed more and more of this, and maybe it's just kind of the day that we're in. But I've had a lot of people say, once you told me that I could retire and I had enough money based on my expenses and everything was great, going to work just became easier. And so one of the things I would say to people that maybe you're burnt out on work, or, it bothers you, you have to be there, give us a phone call. Come sit down with me. Let me show you if you have the option to retire today. And maybe the answer is you don't. But I've sat with dozens of people that have said, Trey, you're the first person that put together a plan that showed me I could retire, and literally going to work the next day was easier just because I knew that I didn't have to keep going. I had one guy that said, Trey, it was easy to work another 2 years after I first met with you, because every day I would say to myself, if my manager, excuse the language, but he'd say, pisses me off one more time, I knew I could basically retire that day and that everything would be okay. And that made it easier for him to work an extra 2 years. So I would just say, come and sit down and see what your options are. Maybe working another year or two wasn't a part of your goals, but if you know that you have the option, or that working another year or two is the difference between being comfortable in retirement or being stressed in retirement, that might be the thing that you need to hear. So I want to encourage you, if you've been listening to our podcast, or maybe this is your first one and you've never experienced having a financial advisor put together a spend down plan and a minimizing your taxes plan, give me a phone call. We'd love to do that for you, complimentary, just to see if there's areas that we can add value that you currently don't have a partner in.
I would add a couple things. I think that you have a much more balanced approach to this conversation, whereas for me, it's like I look at all the different variables and how much they can change. Your expenses, inflation, your rate of return on your investments. And I'm like, hey, yeah, you can make it. Our software shows you've got a pretty good chance of success until the age of 90 or 100, whatever that is. But I'm like, hey, you're one financial emergency or disaster away from financial ruin. And depending on what that looks like I love the idea of like, hey, work as long as possible. And I know that that's just, I'm not trying to be fearful on this stuff. I think different approaches, and you're much more optimistic. And I'm like, hey, there's a couple of things change and they go in the wrong direction. Like we're going to be looking to help you out here.
Well, I think though, that's where, when we look at our software, what's important for people to know is when you do projections, your outputs are only as good as your inputs. Yeah. And so one of the things that we do is we plug in numbers that, a group of PhDs in math have said, if you use this for inflation, if you use 4% for returns through retirement, well, most of the people that we work with are in portfolios that, are averaging 6 or 8 or 10 or 12%. Obviously, depending on their risk level, we're not guaranteeing returns. But if I look over the last 9 years I've been in the business, the majority of our clients have a little bit of stock or a lot of stock, and they're averaging, at least 50% or twice as much as we're doing projections for. So, the other side is I am more optimistic, but it's because we're using very conservative numbers. Yeah. I also tell people every year, you're not okay. You can't retire. So I'm honest with people, but I do think it's true that I'm more optimistic in using conservative numbers where, your mindset is we better be ready for World War III.
and I'm not talking like, of course, like I love using historical norms. I love, trusting in the software, putting in all the, conservative rates of return and inflation, all that stuff. I'm talking about like when the outliers happen. And what if you're like the one person that happens to experience a few of the outliers in terms of like a healthcare emergency? That's what I'm talking about, where it's like, hey, I want to make sure that I have enough cushion, not just to, to have a very likely chance of success. I want to make sure that there's enough just in case, like I do end up experiencing one of these things that are as unlikely as it is, I want to make sure that I'm going to be okay in the event anything happens. That's it.
Well, I think with that mindset that you'll retire at a healthy age of 90.